first time anybody ever talked about building something like Capitol Lake, it was in the 1890s when Leopold Schmidt came to town and talked about damming the mouth of the Deschutes River to benefit shipping. Every step of the way, there have always been people who opposed the creation of Capitol Lake. And for 60 years, from the original time that it was thought up to when it was finally built in 1951, the people who opposed the creation of the lake, they stopped the lake from being built. Most people, up until recent years, have told the story of Capitol Lake as an idea that spawned out of a plan for the Capitol campus, and that is untrue. When Wilder and White, the Capitol campus architects, showed up in Olympia in 1911, there was this idea already laying out there to dam the Deschutes River, or at the time with the Deschutes Waterway, because it was an urban commercial waterway. The Wilder and White plan for Capitol Lake wasn't, from their point of view, a plan for the Capitol campus. They got a question from the city fathers. You have this plan for the Capitol campus. How should we meld how we build the city based on your plan for the Capitol campus? And Wilder and White were like, we're just going to shoot some ideas back. And in those ideas, in this letter that is often cited as how Wilder and White talk about Capitol Lake, it was simply a list of ideas for the city to consider growing. Doc Carline and those guys took that idea back and said, okay, we're going to do this. And this was in 1915. Tumwater went bananas. They thought this was a horrendous idea. I mean, one of the headlines in the papers at the time is damming Deschutes Estuary vigorously opposed.
We are members of the Medicine Creek Nation. Our people signed a treaty in 1854 with the federal government. In this treaty, it stated for as long as the rivers run, the grass grows, the sun rises, that we would be able to fish and harvest in our usual and accustomed area. The Deschutes area, the Deschutes, is one of our ancient areas. One of our ancestors, Johnny and Mary Scallopine, were one of the last known of our tribal people that had a smokehouse right where the Olympia brewery is. And this area was very important for harvesting the salmon. It was a social part of the tribal life to harvest salmon, and everybody would have these songs that could be sung to honor the gift of the salmon. The salmon for the area of the Deschutes people was very important. It represented not just the food or the economics, it also represented family.
Public attitude has shifted towards estuary restoration. DIRT was established as the CLAMP work group was disbanded. Since that time, DIRT has educated and recruited thousands of interested, like-minded estuary supporters.
I represented Thurston County on the CLAMP. When I first arrived on that committee, I had a different point of view than I did by the time the committee issued its recommendation. As we all know, the CLAMP committee's recommendation was a two-pronged recommendation to restore the estuary and to develop a shared strategy for dealing with the resulting silt that, instead of now being trapped in Capitol Lake, would make its way to Bud Inlet, knowing that both the Yacht Club as well as the Port of Olympia had a deep interest in what would happen if we removed the dam and that silt escaped from Capitol Lake into Bud Inlet. I arrived at my agreement with that recommendation through a series of meetings of the CLAMP committee, during which we considered many of the scientific studies that are still available for people to review now, in which I learned some pretty important points. Primary among them, that water quality in Capitol Lake is not only a problem now, but was going to be a problem forever.
One of the papers came out with an editorial soon after the creation of the lake saying it's going to turn into a swamp. It's going to fill up with silt and it's going to turn into a swamp, and we're going to end up calling it Capitol Swamp.
What we've done by putting that dam in is that we have chopped off the southernmost part of Puget Sound. We've severed that connection, and that never has good results.
The estuary wasn't just an estuary. That was our preschool. That was our grade school, that was our high school, our colleges, where our people would share the generational scientific knowledge of what was happening on the land. We would talk about the changes of the fresh water into marine water, and it would give us such an opportunity because it was the greatest classroom ever. And we utilized this Deschutes River as a classroom, and not just an area where we just lived, but it was an area of great importance. When we talk about traditional knowledge, it is academic knowledge that came from generations and generations of people that truly and honestly cared about the estuaries and about the land and our interaction to the land and to the water and what we did with the animal nations and the plant nations.
In the movement of water, sediment, wood, and fish, the dams tend to impede that progress going up or down, and it tends to affect the health of the estuary, the health of the populations of the fish that are associated with it. For the most part, I think sediment redistribution will be a really important part of the system because that will recreate the marshes, the mudflats, the other structures that are then important for the salmon.
We need to be looking at the watershed as a whole system, the river, the estuary, Puget Sound, the ocean beyond that, and we need to make it whole again.
One of the biggest challenges for Tumwater is the water quality on the Deschutes. And it isn't the main stem Deschutes that runs through our community, but it's the water quality downstream in the lake, in Bud Bay. We have dissolved oxygen problems. We have temperature problems. And as Tumwater grows, those problems inhibit our ability to build community. And that's economic development, that's jobs, that's parks and trails and recreation, that's all of those things that we want in our community. They're inhibited by the water quality problems as a result of this lake.
Since its construction, the dam has trapped an estimated 60 to 80% of sediment transported by the river. The lake was dredged in 1978 and 1986. A mid-1990s proposal to dredge again was declined. Dredging is not a sustainable practice to keep up with the sheer volume of sediment deposited from upriver.
The sediment interface with water is where all life is happening in the estuary. It's where the gas exchange happens. It's where the plant growth is happening. It's where the worms and the clams and the things that we don't necessarily see or think about. That is the lifeblood of an estuary. Carbon that is taken out of the atmosphere and put into plant tissues gets stored in the underground root mats of marsh plants. I've been working a lot with a group from Restore America's Estuaries nationally, both here in Puget Sound and in Chesapeake, involving this idea that if you can protect and restore marshes, you're going to increase the amount of carbon that's stored underground in their root mats. As the sediment does come down into the estuary, it's burying the carbon in the root mat underneath the sediment and locking it away from the atmosphere. Those conditions, we call it coastal blue carbon or carbon sequestration, and it's a very important process, so important that we're now able to quantify it and be able to sell carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. So you can actually offset greenhouse gas emissions by doing marsh sequestration projects. Those only work, however, if there is an ample sediment supply coming from a naturally flowing river to be able to bury those carbon sources in the roots.
When that estuary is restored, brackish water will flow all the way up to the falls in Tumwater. And there's no other place in Puget Sound where you have a really majestic river like the Deschutes tumbling down into an estuary and brackish water. I mean, it's a really unique geologic location, geographic location, cultural location.
Restoration projects are kind of a combination of natural science and social science. And there's always a lot of hemming and hawing about should we do something. It's very expensive. It may be unpopular. There may not be full buy-off of what the future condition is going to be once we do restoration. But in every case I've ever been involved with, it generally increases the biological health, increases recreation, increases tourism, increases the connectivity that the people have to the water body and their care for it and their interest in it going forward.
This was a really expensive project. And one of the arguments against it is that we've got an entire Puget Sound to restore. So why would we prioritize this project over other ones? It's important to note that with the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Project, that they rated this project as one of the top 18 of over 900 projects to restore Puget Sound. That's pretty significant. It's 260 acres of habitat that can be restored. And as a result, it's also a very expensive project.
In 2009, estimated costs for estuary restoration were projected between $50 to $212 million, whereas lake maintenance would cost approximately $152 to $362 million.
Part of that is just logic. It removes the long-term maintenance. If we want to try to maintain a lake, it's so prohibitively expensive because we're talking about dredging for, in perpetuity, forever.
One of the challenges the marine terminal faces is the need to dredge periodically. We can't afford to dredge, even though the Army Corps of Engineers foots the dredging bill because of contaminated sediments from past activities. We have to pay millions of dollars to dispose of the sediments. Also, when dredging activities take place, the contaminants in the sediment are distributed throughout the water column, and that's not good for the local environment. So there are costs economically and there are costs environmentally.
Taking care of the Deschutes watershed and Bud Bay is an expensive proposition, mostly to mitigate to what degree we can, the impacts of building a city right at the mouth of the river. I don't know that there's a fiscal upside, but I know that it's, to my mind and to my heart, it's a necessary expense.
In most cases, there's a national press around this. The Restore America's Estuaries did a publication a few years ago that for like every dollar spent in doing ecological restoration in estuaries, there's a $7 return in the economic benefit from the restored state.
So you got this pool of water that is, breeding invasive species, both plant species and snails and bugs and all this other stuff. And nobody really can do anything in there. You don't see kayaks in there. You don't see people swimming. You don't see people fishing. Let's get that back into, a natural function of an estuary and let people get up there and go fishing, kayaking, and things like that.
We all care about the future of this place because when that area is redeveloped, we want it to be a hub of activity. And that hub of activity includes recreation on the Deschutes River. It includes kayaking, it includes swimming. I recently talked to a woman at a meeting over the donation of the Brewhouse Tower, and she mentioned after the meeting, she said, I learned to swim in front of the Brewhouse Tower. I learned how to swim right there at the falls where the river dumps into the estuary. And I hope that one day families will be able to bring their children there and do the same.
I'm a very active user, actually, of Capitol Lake, and I would much rather it be a natural system. I wouldn't stop going down there. I wouldn't stop using it. I know the trails would all still be there. There would be more wildlife to see, more natural wildlife, shorebirds.
In the case of the Deschutes estuary, the birding community is on board because they see how sick the lake situation is. It's full of invasives and exotics and toxic algae and water quality problems. And, when folks come to visit the capital city, when folks come to Tumwater, that's embarrassing. We've got this really majestic, dynamic river in the Deschutes that, comes rolling out of the National Forest and through all of those farmlands and through the center of our community, and it dumps into not Puget Sound, but a really sick lake.
A restored estuary would also be a signal to the broader community, to people who want to come play or do business in Olympia, that we can make decisions, we can take care of our water, we can take care of the salmon, moving forward in a progressive direction.
We have a lot of partners wanting this to happen. Some of them are municipalities, state, and we just got to make it happen. And I'm all about helping out the businesses and keeping them there, but they have to do their part too.
We have opportunities to do better economically, environmentally, and for the community. And those are the port's three primary goals. And a restored estuary provides opportunities for increased recreation and tourism.
Maximizing the ecological function of the watershed, restoring water quality in Bud Bay, making it as fertile of a nursery for salmon and other creatures in the estuary as we can get to, is an obligation as a person who lives in the community and on the earth. I think it's about moving forward as a community to continue to evolve as a city and as infrastructure as best practices change. I don't think that walls of concrete are the best practice anymore. We've gotten smarter in our experience, and it's going to cost some money to reset and move forward in a way that's kinder to all of the other creatures on the earth.
We get so many visitors from out of the area to come to the farmers market because it's such a beautiful location. And so many of the local people that I've talked with would love to be able to do more things down in the marine area. So in the long term, if we could open up that area for people to use in more ways to enjoy the natural environment, if a restored Deschutes flow could bring back the salmon runs locally, and we could have people interacting with nature in a richer and healthier way, I think that's a beautiful vision for our area.
When they built a park around it, it became a cesspool-like swimming beach that never really served its purpose. And as soon as the late 1960s, they had commissions and boards and task force to try to solve the Capitol Lake problem. And they kept on issuing reports and studying and coming together all the way through the 60s and 70s and 80s. They're trying to force something on a body of water that just doesn't fit. And my vision of the future is that if we just let it be what it needs to be, then it can be something useful to the community.
We've all made mistakes in our lives, and communities have made mistakes, and other communities have been able to reverse those mistakes. And I think it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge that we've made those mistakes. But I see an opportunity to restore this estuary and create a whole generation of South Sound residents who never knew or never saw that mistake.
I believe I speak for all members of the committee when I say it has been deeply disappointing to all of us that at the end of that very lengthy multi-year process with many people doing lots of work, we made that recommendation to Department of Enterprise Services at that time, General Administration. And virtually nothing has happened since we made that recommendation in 2009. And here we are, 7 or now almost 8 years later, with no action being taken. Last year, DES contracted with the Ruckelshaus Center out of Seattle to do what they refer to as key informant interviews. What I said to the Ruckelshaus Center last year was, we've gone long beyond the time of inaction. It's time for this community to take action. And I lay that primarily at the feet of the City of Olympia and the State of Washington.
Our value system isn't about the dollars. The value system is about having the quality of life. And the quality of life is so here at the Deschutes if we are willing to unlock it, untie those things that bind the Deschutes River, let the river run free.